What's up, everybody? Welcome to Omnipotent Health and Fitness episode number 7. Our guest today is a microbiologist, a chemist, and an adjunct professor at the University of New Mexico. He also worked for 12 years as an entrepreneur scientist at the Los Alamos National Laboratories, where he led the applied genomics team, developing and applying modern genomics to areas of the gut microbiome, pathogen detection, and even cancer biology. However, before all of that, when he was a teenager, he left Yugoslavia and arrived in the US with literally no money. But through a relentless work ethic and a passion for improving humanity, he scratched and clawed his way up to becoming the co-founder and chief science officer of Viome Life Sciences. So please help me in welcoming the man who can predict the future simply by creating it, Dr. Momo Vuyisich. Momo, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you for coming. So I actually found your origin story extremely fascinating, and that's actually where I want to start. How did you get to this point all the way from Yugoslavia?
Well, unfortunately, I was in Yugoslavia at the time of the Civil War and the breakup of communism. So rough times, really rough times. If you can avoid civil wars, do your best to do that. That's a terrible situation. So yeah, I left when I was 20, and I came to the United States and started my education, went for college microbiology degree, went for PhD chemistry, and did all the postdocs and all that, and had sort of a career planned out in drug discovery and health applications. And then, well, that's my sort of coming to America story, which is, very common for a lot of immigrants.
Yeah, no, I find it absolutely incredible, honestly. And, my parents are first generation immigrants as well and saw that firsthand. Tell me about how you got into, I guess, microbiology and potentially threading that with your story with your battle with rheumatoid arthritis at a very early age.
Yeah, I've just always been fascinated by two things. One is anything that flies, and science. So I mean, science is just so cool. It's just an incredible thing that everywhere you look, it's an amazing thing, right? There's just so many examples in nature that are just so fascinating, and our bodies are fascinating as well. So that human physiology and understanding the underlying physiology has always been interesting. So yeah, so I was going through all my scientific studies and everything else, and unfortunately, in grad school is when I developed this rheumatoid arthritis. It's at first it was carpal tunnel syndrome, and of course the doctors thought, well, you're just typing too much for your thesis, and then it was creaky fingers, and I'm in my 20s, I shouldn't have creaky fingers, and then my hips started to hurt, and then my knees started to hurt, and then my back started to hurt, and this is not something that happens overnight. It's sort of over a period of 3 or 4 years. It's sort of every week. It's just a little bit worse. So yeah, that chronic disease lasted for about 10 years. I bounced from doctor to doctor, and no one really knew what it was. They suspected it was either ankylosing spondylitis or rheumatoid arthritis, or autoimmune is what most doctors thought it was. Autoimmune is an escape word for, I have no idea what's wrong with you, but we can pour some medicines on you and make you feel better. That's basically a catch-all phrase for autoimmune. So unfortunately, I was in that frustrating situation where no one really knew what it was. But I, as a chemist, rejected the idea that a chronic disease is a bad luck. It's simply chemistry that's occurring in your body that we don't understand. That's all it is, right? Any disease is just chemistry that we don't yet understand. And so I spent several years reading the literature and looking for anything about chronic inflammation, and finally found, I tried every diet on the planet, every single diet, until I tried the ketogenic diet. And ketogenic diet scared me because I started losing my memory within 3 months of starting the ketogenic diet, and it didn't make me feel any better in terms of my autoimmune. And so I quit all those diets, and I just started reading. And finally I found a mechanism by which it's possible that a human body could mount a systemic immune response, which is a type of a glycan found in mammalian food products. So if any kind of dairy product or any kind of red meat contains a glycan called Mu5GC, and when we are unable to make it, but we can actually, when we introduce it from the diet, it can get incorporated into our bodies, and our immune system can recognize it as foreign. And that's exactly what was going on with me. And so one day I just simply stopped 100% cleanly eating all mammalian food products. And that's very important because this glycan gets incorporated into our cells, which means that its half-life is estimated to be about a month, which means that it lingers there for a long time. And if you eat one mammalian meal even once a month, it'll still replenish the supply there. And so it was very important that I make a very 100% clean cut. I did that in a couple of months. I realized this is likely it. A couple of months later, wow, this is really it. It took my body about a year, just a little over a year to heal. My right hip was so damaged due to this inflammation that I had to stop backpacking. And I sometimes, even on a hike, I had to stop hiking. And we're talking about under 800 milligrams of ibuprofen or like naproxen or something. So my right hip was really the worst part of my body. And that took over a year to heal. But I haven't had any symptoms of that disease now for many, many years. On 3 occasions, I actually did an experiment on myself and I said, okay, I'm going to introduce in this one meal a mammalian food product to see what happens. And I did that 3 times, and all 3 times the symptoms came back. And it's a fascinating thing to observe how wherever I feel the creakiness and the pain in my joints, I know that that molecule is being incorporated into the joints and my immune system is attacking it. And so I'm not going to do that again, but that's that. So yeah, I realized that, through my scientific research and through all of the reading that I did, that chronic diseases are, and now this has been revealed in peer-reviewed literature, is that chronic diseases and cancers are mostly influenced by our environment, by food and our lifestyle. They have very, very small fraction contributed by genetics. And so we can truly influence how they are. And this has been revealed now. Unfortunately, the end of each one of these studies is you should eat healthy. But what do you eat, right? I mean, you should eat healthy is not a good advice because there are so many ways of that people interpret that. And so it's really meaningless. So anyways.
Absolutely. I think that's astonishing. And I do want to hop back around now in retrospect, looking back. I was wondering whether you had a hypothesis as to why the ketogenic diet was worse than any of the other diets that you had tried.
Oh yeah. I mean, I have a very strong hypothesis. So this new 5GC, this glycan, it gets incorporated into epithelial cells of the human body. It's just a normal part of the extracellular matrix. So it sits on the outside of the cell, and we used to have it. Homo species used to have it, but we lost it about 2 million years ago. Anyways, so the blood-brain barrier is nothing but a layer of epithelial cells. Mm-hmm. And so my immune system was basically attacking my own epithelial cells and were causing my blood-brain barrier to be leaky, which is very bad because once the immune system goes into the central nervous system, it actually can attack inside, the neurons. And so that's what I think happened. Of course, I don't have any proof for that, but one day we will definitely go after the blood-brain barrier and all these neurodegenerative diseases. But I think it's one of the ways in which the blood-brain barrier permeability comes on using this mechanism where some kind of an antigen is incorporated into the epithelium. And it can be this, or it can be some kind of, oxidized lipids that we consume a lot from like fried foods. It can be pesticides that can modify the proteins that are on the surface of epithelial cells. So we are introducing, the FDA has approved 10,000 synthetic chemicals that don't occur in nature to be consumed, right? They're safe for consumption. But our immune system has not evolved to deal with these 10,000 chemicals. And so we don't know really what happens to them in the body. Sure, a majority of them are either peed out or metabolized, but you can't account for 100% of them. So if a small fraction of them end up bound to some proteins in our epithelium, our immune system can go after them and weaken the gut lining, weaken the gums, weaken the blood-brain barrier. All these are epithelial layers. And that's why I think that's one of the major contributors to chronic diseases, that we're simply triggering the immune system. And on the other hand, we're not providing the food for our gut microbiome, which then escalates the situation even more. So it's like a 2-pronged attack.
Yeah. It's funny. We just had Dom D'Agostino on to talk about ketogenic diet. And I think you mentioned partially that people on ketogenic diet might make the blood-brain barrier a little bit more permeable, actually, which is interesting. And I wonder if that contributed to it as well. Though he also has there was a study that was like that the ketogenic diet may potentially decrease inflammation, working on the NLRP3 inflammasome pathway.
Right.
So it's interesting, conflicting pathways, but that's such a science, right?
Yeah, well, I think the bottom line is that there is no one diet fits all, and that for some people, ketogenic diet may work well, but clearly not for everyone. And the same thing is true for Mediterranean diet or any other diet. These are artificial constructs created by people who were desperate enough to try different things. It worked for them. They got really excited about, and now they're promoting it for everyone. That's basically the history of these diets. These are this, ketogenic diet does not exist in nature. That's not natural, and neither does any diet. It's a human construct.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, it sounds like at Viome, the hypothesis, and there is growing evidence that pretty much of our pathologies that we face today is related to the gut microbiome. Can you explain or just describe all the different sort of paths that the gut microbiome might affect as far as, GI system or
Yeah,
obesity
yeah,
or cancer, whichever direction you want to go. I know it's
yeah.
very broad, so.
I mean, I can only really give a few examples because the topic is so broad, it would take us days to just skim it. That's
Of
how
course.
broad it is. There's now, if you guys go, if the audience just goes to like NCBI and searches for the term gut microbiome, look at the exponential growth of the publications, right? It's just crazy. There's literally no disease or cancer that has not been connected to microbiome. So let me just give a few really interesting examples. So first example is that human breast milk contains foods, calories that human genes cannot process. Okay, so every single woman makes breast milk that contains human milk oligosaccharides that have evolutionarily been designed to feed the gut microbiome of the infant and not to feed the human physiology. And those human milk oligosaccharides feed specific species of bifidobacteria that basically occupy the space. They are friendly bacteria. They're good for the infant. They help the immune system develop properly. And most importantly, they prevent the growth of what we call enterobacteria, or some people call them proteobacteria as well, because that's a higher order. And these are pro-inflammatory and disease-causing bacteria, these enterobacteria. And so right from the beginning, from birth, we're already designed to feed our gut microbiome. And that's because we have co-evolved with the gut microbiome. Gut microbiome is not a visitor. It's not an unwelcome visitor. It's not a strange object. We are literally, I want everyone to understand that the oral microbiome and the gut microbiome and vaginal microbiome, they are integral to our body. We are not human. We are human and microbiome, right? And so right from birth, bam, that's one thing. The second thing is, the second example that I really like to give is that, with the COVID pandemic, lots of studies have been done, and it turns out that, how some people don't respond to vaccines, other people respond to vaccines, and immunologists wanted to find out, well, why is it that you expose a human body to an antigen and some people develop the memory for that antigen and other people do not? And so there is a molecular process that a T cell that responds to that antigen, in this case, SARS-CoV-2 virus, a T cell has to convert to a memory T cell. This is an immortalized cell that will circulate in your body for decades and be able to respond to any future infections. That molecular trigger of conversion from a T cell to a memory T cell requires butyrate. And butyrate must be produced by the gut microbiome in the colon. It cannot be consumed. It doesn't come from the sky. It doesn't magically appear. It must be produced in situ in the colon. And to produce butyrate in the colon, you have to have butyrate producing microorganisms, and you have to feed them the fibers that they use to digest in order to make that butyrate. So all of this has been occurring for millennia, but today we have done a really good job of exterminating these butyrate-producing bacteria from our gut microbiomes due to overuse of antibiotics, overuse of fiber-free food, and overuse of foods that contain preservatives that kill bacteria. And we have done a great job of simply removing the fibers. If you look at white bread, it's missing the fiber that's feeding your microbiome. It's only feeding you and making you fat, and you remove the fibers that are actually supposed to feed your microbiome. So that's another example that's really critical, that the microbiome functions in the gut are essential for creating long-term memory for infectious disease, which is amazing. Another example I want to give of the importance of gut microbiome, and there are hundreds, but these are really extraordinary examples, is that every doctor that you ask, what is wrong with people who have bipolar disorder? Every doctor will tell you something is wrong with their brain. And every doctor is wrong about that, okay? Because there's now an example, a well-documented, peer-reviewed, published example of a woman who had a bipolar disorder. Drugs worked partly for her, but never really. She could not have a normal life. She performed fecal microbiota transplant from her husband to her over a 6-month period. And her bipolar disorder completely went away. She was cured. 3 years later, her doctor, who had been following her and phenotyping her the whole time, said that 3 years later, she was effectively cured. She no longer had bipolar disorder, right? And that's because the neurotransmitters that are produced in the gut lining are directly transported or signaling to the brain via the vagus nerve. And we're now starting to tease these things apart, that it's the gut microbiome that's signaling the production of serotonin, dopamine, and all those neurotransmitters that are controlling our brain chemistry. So our brain chemistry is not controlled in the brain, it's controlled by the gut microbiome. So that's a really phenomenal sort of causative in a human being demonstration that it's the gut microbiome. And then I'll give one more example, which has now been revealed, which is in oncology, in cancers. Every single solid tumor that has been sequenced to date contains microorganisms in it. And it has now been established that the microorganisms are living inside the tumor cells. They're producing proteins that are displayed on the surface of the tumor cells. And those proteins that are produced by the microbiome are telling the immune system, hey, there's nothing here for you to see. So the microbes and the cancer cells are working together to create an immunoprotective environment to protect themselves from the immune system. To me, that's extraordinary. And while we're on oncology, I'll give one more final example, which is that you have probably heard about immunotherapy, right? As sort of the newest, most effective way of treating people with cancer to complete remission, right? Just with immunotherapy. So recently, two very large studies from very respectful organizations, they showed that if some people respond to immunotherapy, others don't. And so they took non-responders and they killed all their microbiome and they replaced it with poop from the responders. That's all they've done. It's the same people. They still have the same cancer. They did not respond to immunotherapy. They just swapped their poop from the responders and they became responders. To me, that's extraordinary. They didn't change their diet. They didn't change their physiology. They didn't do any gene editing. They didn't change a new drug. They don't have a new cancer. Everything is the same. They literally just installed poop from another person and bam, their immune system now starts killing their tumor. That is an extraordinary finding.
It's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the studies coming out on fecal transplants are absolutely mind-blowing sometimes, the results that you hear about, and you think that it's this sci-fi thing, that this can't be real, but it's popping up all over the place. It's incredible.
So these are examples that I wanted to give for how critical, how essential, how central role the gut microbiome plays in our health and disease. And oral microbiome is turning out to have very, very similar contribution, and that's why we're studying it very, very intensely right now. And vaginal microbiome for women is also turning out to play a significant role in vaginal health, but also in reproductive health and being able to conceive and having preterm birth or regular health, and so healthy baby and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah. Incredible. It really touches many aspects, or pretty much all aspects of health. I really we could really dive deep into any one of those subjects, but I was wondering if we could touch briefly on some of them. You mentioned early on, breast milk and containing something that our human body really doesn't utilize at all. Are there any studies that test the microbiome, comparing babies who were strictly only breastfed versus those who were formula fed, and what were the changes that were found in the
Yeah,
microbiome?
so there are lots of studies, and so this all started at the nutrition department at UC Davis. And this is again a very long story that we don't have time for. I encourage people who are interested in this to look at the original UC Davis publications. They spun out a company called Viome Biosciences, and they actually have a probiotic for infants that is a Bifidobacterium infantis that can specifically consume the human milk oligosaccharides and create a healthy environment to prevent colic and colitis and other inflammatory conditions of the baby. So literally this company has published in top journals, very methodical. I'm just a big fan of that company. I mean, the audience can read and see, but it's a very well documented, convincing evidence. There's no doubt that this is very important.
Fascinating. I was going to briefly touch on C-section versus vaginal birth. Could you briefly speak about that difference?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a body of literature that shows that C-section babies don't have the same microbiome as vaginal babies, but later on, 3 to 6 months later, they basically merge. My take on this is that women today are super clean. Women from 1,000 years ago didn't have toilet paper, didn't have toilets. There was poop all over the anus and vagina, right, at all times. When the baby was born, it already, at that moment in time during birth, was acquiring all of the microorganisms that are in the mother's poop. And that's how they became basically inoculated with the healthy microbes. And that because you have microbes that are anaerobic, right, that cannot survive outside the poop, and yet they're passed generation to generation. That can really only be explained by the baby acquires those germs right at birth. And today everything's so sterile. In fact, C-section mothers, they're actually given antibiotics for a whole week before C-section, just to prevent anything. But now you're really disrupting that whole natural process, not only by C-section but also antibiotics. So we've simply created so many things in our lives that are so non-natural that now we are basically paying the price of that, in that we have escalated chronic diseases and cancers that are just historically record high. You have a situation where in the UK today, with 64 million citizens, the number one disease from which people die, both women and men in the UK since 2018, has been Alzheimer's disease. 50 years ago, Alzheimer's disease was a rarity. It was so rare that most people didn't know about it. It was in medical books. And today it's the number one killer. It exceeded all cancers and heart disease and everything else, right? That is because we have completely destroyed our way of life that we evolved with in so many different ways.
Right. Yeah, the clean gene hypothesis is really something that's really showing that it has broad reaches in all aspects of health. You also mentioned the microorganisms that might produce butyrate in order to essentially prime ourselves to be ready our immune system to learn about other pathogens, to form memory T cells, essentially.
Right.
What are those organisms? And shifting over a little bit to Viome, do you predict in the future that we would give somebody a concoction before immunization to help prime the body to improve the learning of that pathogen?
Yeah, well, most people, turns out, have butyrate producers. It's just that you have to identify which ones they have, and exactly for those butyrate producers, what fibers you need to feed them. So that can already be, that we already do that today. Not, just to be clear, we do not have a program that specifically produces butyrate for the purpose of conversion of T cells to memory T cells, but our nutritional recommendations for every person provide specific foods and even supplements that are prebiotics that feed their specific butyrate producers, because every person has a different subset of butyrate producers and they have different amounts in their gut. And so you really have to customize that. You can't just take any fiber because they may not have it. And some fibers can actually overgrow certain bacteria that are actually not necessarily producing good butyrate, and that may cause things like SIBO and gas and bloating. And so you have to be really careful with this stuff. You can't just apply a shotgun approach where, the guidelines in general are eat 50 grams of fiber per day, but there are hundreds of different kinds of fibers and they come in so many different kinds of foods. That's not a good advice because, some people can develop all kinds of other conditions due to overeating fiber. And so that's unfortunate. Everything should be data driven. It shouldn't be just shotgun, apply the same rule to everyone. We really have to analyze an ecosystem, understand who's there, what are they capable of doing, and what are they actually doing, how they're interacting with each other. And then you have to provide the right foods. And it turns out, for example, one of the microorganisms that most people will be familiar with is called Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. That's one of the main producers of butyrate. But it turns out that Faecalibacterium prausnitzii doesn't actually produce butyrate from a fiber. It actually cross-feeds from specific, other bacteria that are found in the gut microbiome. So there are layers of complexity in the gut microbiome, and you have to measure it in very, very high level of detail in order to be able to make these precise recommendations for every single person. And so today, our recommendations are made using machine learned algorithms. They're all made using math. There is no human being involved in any process whatsoever, from a stool sample, from the moment that a person provides a stool sample until they get their recommendations. There is no human involvement whatsoever. The stool goes to the CLIA lab, the chemistry is measured using metatranscriptomic technology, and then mathematical algorithms interpret that chemistry and make the recommendations completely objectively. And we have 250,000 customers and we have 250,000 diets. Right. It's literally that simple.
Yeah, so it sounds like everybody is quite individualized as to especially the gut microbiome. But broadly speaking, if you could create a perfect microbiome, is there such a thing where there's a perfect ratio of these millions of microbes?
Yeah, so you could do that, but you would have to introduce that microbiome at birth so that the immune system develops in such a way that it tolerates basically that microbiome, right? Because the microbiome and our immune system interact constantly. 70% of the immune system is in the mucosa of the intestines. And so you can't, for example, some people take probiotics and their immune system rejects them. Even though they're healthy for others, they're rejected by the immune system because simply the immune system hasn't developed tolerance. So a big portion of our immune system is obviously devoted to fighting pathogens. But even a larger portion of our immune system is devoted to understanding what to develop tolerance towards. So for example, our immune system must develop tolerance for the tens of thousands of antigens that are found in foods. Otherwise, it'll reject them and we'll have constant diarrhea, right? Mm-hmm. And so developing immune tolerance is super important, and you have to do that early on in life. And we don't yet know how that is developed later on in life. But one day we may figure that out, and we may in fact have some kind of a super healthy concoction of probiotics that everyone should be taking. But we don't have the data for that right now.
Right. And just to introduce some terms to myself and the audience as well, are there any big heavy hitters, microorganism species that we really need to be paying attention to as far as the healthy gut microbiome?
Yeah, so there are probably something on the order of 10 to 50 species that are considered healthy as based on the publications. And these are members of the genera of Clostridia, so Clostridium something. They are also very good butyrate producers. Bacteroides are super important. Genus Bacteroides is super important, healthy. And then Faecalibacterium is a species, but it should have been really a genus because the members of that species are so diverse. And then there's Akkermansia muciniphila. That's also considered to be a very healthy microorganisms. Unfortunately, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii and Akkermansia have also been shown to cause potential problems. And so, for example, I'll just give you one example. Akkermansia was specifically identified via molecular mechanisms to have a potential to cause multiple sclerosis. And so we have to be very careful when we discuss any healthy or bad microorganisms to understand that a simple microorganism like Akkermansia codes 4,000 genes. It encodes 4,000 genes, meaning 4,000 functions. And if 10 of those are super healthy for us, that's great. We have to learn how to stimulate those 10 healthy functions. But if one of them causes multiple sclerosis, we really have to be careful in understanding what are the circumstances? What are the cross-feeding patterns with the other microorganisms? What are the foods that can trigger the expression of this one gene that can potentially trigger the immune system of the person to develop multiple sclerosis? So we at Viome don't really have a list of good and bad microorganisms, because even E. coli, everyone thinks E. coli is bad because it can kill you or it can produce LPS that can cause inflammation. Sure, but these enterobacteria that we always discuss in the bad context, we have also co-evolved to have them. And that's why majority of the people have E. coli in their gut microbiome. Enterobacteria are absolutely essential for transporting iron from the lumen of the intestines into our blood, right? And being absorbed by our, or utilized by our mitochondria. And so you have a case where someone is anemic and the doctors don't know what it is, but the nutritionist gives them iron and they consume more iron, and yet they're still anemic. That's because we don't transport iron from the gut lumen directly into the bloodstream. We transport it with the help of bacteria. So the bacteria actually produce these molecules called siderophores. And siderophores are like little molecules that capture iron from the food. And those bacteria do it for themselves. But some of that siderophore that captures iron actually crosses over into the bloodstream, and mitochondria that are remnants of bacteria that have incorporated themselves into our own cells, they actually can capture that iron. And so we really have to think of almost so there are traditional pathogens like Vibrio cholerae. You don't want that, right? You don't want norovirus. Those don't have a potential to be healthy. But even something like Clostridium difficile that kills tens of thousands of people per year, it's actually a natural commensal microorganism that is very healthy. It produces butyrate, right? So we really have to shift our minds to almost every bacterium has the potential to be healthy and has the potential to be not healthy. It depends on what you feed the gut microbiome, and it depends on how they interact with each other. And the only way you can figure that out is by doing a very, very high resolution test to understand who is there, how they're playing together, so that you can then figure out what do we feed these microbes and what do we not feed them.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. To shift gears just a tiny bit, and before we switch over to talking about what you guys are doing at Viome and the very important work that you're doing there. But something that I've always wondered is, I've been very protective about taking antibiotics and whether I need it or not. And I definitely advocate for myself and really try not to when I don't need to.
Yep.
But for somebody that is prescribed something like amoxicillin or something like that for, let's say, strep, is there a protocol or something that they can do after they take it to help improve the gut biome? And how bad is it after you take like a 10-day course of amoxicillin?
Yeah, so it depends, right? Everything depends. It's so complex. It depends on which species of bacteria the person already has. It depends on, if a person already has a very rich and diverse microbiome and they have, 100 butyrate producers, then introducing amoxicillin may wipe out 20 of them, and they may be just fine afterwards. They may not feel ill effects, right? But if a person has already depleted their microbiome due to some chronic illness like IBS, or due to chronic GI infections, or consuming foods that have antibiotics and have preservatives, and really depleted that down to a few, butyrate producers or other beneficial microorganisms, not just butyrate, there's many, many other beneficial functions. Now, amoxicillin may actually deplete the big time and really cause a massive problem to where after that one course of antibiotics, they're never the same. And this has been, documented. So it depends. But getting over to the question, so if you look at the peer-reviewed literature, there's literature that shows very specifically, this is actually in babies with colitis, that giving probiotics to the babies concurrently with antibiotics protects their gut microbiome and enables them to recover more effectively. So that's one thing. There are other studies in adults that show that giving probiotics to certain people, the study was very small, I think something like 10 people, giving probiotics concurrently with antibiotics enables those probiotics to establish colonization. And then they cause a perturbance in the gut microbiome that was not there. And in some of those people, that was not beneficial. So, but those people probably already had quite severely depleted microbiome. So again, it depends. Here's my advice. I actually wrote a blog article on this. I had a problem because for 3 years I was on foreign travel. I worked in Africa, I worked in Asia, and so because of that, I was essentially on constant antibiotics, right? Not Cipro, sorry, I never took Cipro, but I had it in my pocket in case. But I was constantly on antibiotics to prevent myself from getting infectious disease and malaria. And at that time, obviously, I didn't know how bad that was. So when I did my first test, when we developed this metatranscriptomic technology, before we even started Viome, I tested my stool and I realized my richness of the microbiome is very, very poor. And so I spent then 3 or 4 years going out in nature, getting my hands dirty, eating my food with hands. You know, in my household, we eat with hands. We started doing organic gardening. And then I think the most important reason that why my gut microbiome is now one of the most rich is because when I pick up carrots from my garden, I literally just shake off the soil. I don't wash them and I don't peel them, and I just eat them like that, right? When I go pick lettuce for my family for dinner, I go pick the lettuce. We had watered that garden with water hose that basically sprayed soil all over this lettuce. And I literally just take these leaves and put them in our bowl, and they have visible soil on them. And so and this is how humans used to eat, 1,000 years ago. We used to dig up roots and eat them. We didn't have peelers. We didn't have soap. We didn't have these tools. You just pull out something from the soil and you eat it. And in fact, a lot of our microbiome can coexist in the gut microbiome, but it can also exist in soil. And so there's a shared. So I think that rewilding the microbiome is a really important concept. And I encourage people to read the book by Dr. Robin Chutkan it's called something like that, Rewilding Your Gut or something like that. She sort of really pioneered that concept on the big scale. I pioneered it to myself and my family, 10 years ago. So rewilding the gut, go be in nature. Obviously, if you go to a public restroom, wash your hands. But if you're out camping and hiking and your nails have dirt under them, that's normal. That's perfectly normal. Go eat your sandwich and dig those nails into the sandwich. It's not a problem.
I love that. That's incredible. Switching over to Viome a little bit, for those who don't know, could you just describe in general, in broad terms, what your company's mission is?
Yeah. So our mission is to put all chronic diseases and cancers into history books, right? So today, my son reads about the Black Plague that wiped out 1/3 of the world's population 7 centuries ago. He reads about that in history books. And that's because today we know what causes plague. We know how to control it. We know how to treat it. And we know how to prevent it, basically. And we no longer have plague outbreaks, right? Because we brought science to that area. We are literally in the 13th century when it comes to chronic diseases and cancers. I have a neighbor who has multiple sclerosis. She is going to die in the next year or two. She will die. There's nothing that we know about multiple sclerosis. And she's just one example, but during my scientific career, early on, I realized, wait a minute, 60% of the American adults have a chronic disease. People are suffering every single day. And yet there's no entity anywhere that is specifically focused on understanding the root causes of chronic diseases. We have academia, and academics are smart and hardworking and have lots of money, but their incentive is to publish papers. If you go read top 100 papers from the year 2000, that's 22 years ago, the theme will be, hey, we're interested in IBS, we're interested in IBD, we're interested in multiple sclerosis, and we've done this fascinating work, and this could lead to a better diagnosis or to therapeutics. That's the end of every paper. It could lead. Yet 22 years later, it has not led to anything. So foundations have been pouring money. The NIH has been pouring money for 50 years into chronic diseases and cancers, and everything could lead to something. And yet it doesn't. It almost never does. So academia are busy publishing papers because that's what their incentive is, right? It's not that they're evil people. It's not that, they don't want to do this. It's just that they're judged based on how many publications they have, not by how many people they've helped live their lives. And I was in that grind. I was an academic and I had to publish papers. On the other hand, we have pharma, and pharma does not want to cure people. It's not their business model. Their business model is to keep people sick and manage their illness so that they can extract the most money out of them. That's the business model. So no one has developed a business model that monetizes on keeping people healthy. Everyone has built a business model where you keep people sick, and that's how you get the most money. And so I realized early on in my scientific career, wait a minute, we're spending trillions of dollars on these two entities, academia and pharma, and no one is actually hammering the nail that needs to be hammered. And so I designed the company basically in 2010. At that point in time, it wasn't designed as a for-profit entity. It was designed as an entity. And I spent 6 years at Los Alamos National Lab developing the technologies that would empower this company. And it just turns out that the best way to scale something and to really solve the problem is as a for-profit entity, because you can actually create products that immediately improve people's lives. You can then use those data to create better products, and you simply keep doing that and keep building a system that is self-learning. The more people you have, the more people you can help in the system. And so that's what we created. Viome is basically doing something that no one else has been doing and no one else seems to have an interest in doing, which is really a sad situation, but we're going to do it. We're going to solve that problem. So when you introduced me in the beginning, I don't know where you got that from, that we're building the better world. I wake up and every single one of my days has nothing to do with speculating what the world is going to look like. I don't speculate. I am building. My teams are building that world where illness will be optional. Computers will be able to tell you exactly what to eat, what not to eat, when to exercise, how to exercise, when to sleep, everything just for you. And you will have the option to live a healthy life. That's why illness will be optional. If you say, you know what, I don't care if I'm going to get a heart attack, I'm not going to give up cheese. I'm going to eat cheese. And if I die at 50 of a heart attack, I'll die a happy person. That will be your choice, right? I make that choice every day. Cheese was one of my favorite foods in my life. I absolutely loved cheese, but I gave it up cold, and I've been healthy for so many years, and I have no interest in eating cheese. I have made my choice. I just, I can give up lamb was difficult to give up for me. I love lamb, but that was difficult to give up. But cheese was really hard. But I make that choice every day because I want to be healthy. I love being healthy. I can do anything I want in my life, and I don't have any problems. So we will empower people to make that choice, and then it's up to everyone to choose what they want to do.
That's amazing, Dr. Vuyisich. I love that. I want to leave time for the Q&A at the end. And before I ask my final question, where can everybody find you or follow your work?
Well, I'm not really, I post quite a bit of stuff on LinkedIn, so people can befriend me on LinkedIn and follow me there. So I post quite a bit of science there. That's pretty much the best way, yes.
Awesome. And so for my final question, if you had a magic genie, you could have one wish, and you could wish for all of humanity to adopt one lifestyle modification that would most greatly impact their health, what would it be?
Ooh, just one, huh?
Mm-hmm.
That's a tough one because there are so many factors. And so is there one that is the worst? Can I have two?
Sure. We'll give you two. We'll give you two wishes.
Okay. On one side, stop consuming foods that have any chemical in them, right? And whether that chemical is labeled that says to preserve freshness, right? To preserve freshness sounds so, oh, that's good for you, right? When in fact, that's a preservative that's killing your oral and gut microbiome. When they say, mouthwash is good for you. No, it's not. It's killing your healthy microbiome. When they label a product, so they label a meat called all natural, right? When you see meat label in the grocery store that says all natural, that's not some descriptive term. That's a legal term. And the legal term for all natural is you can feed the animal and pump them with antibiotics until the moment that they die, okay? The moment that they die, you can no longer add any chemicals. You can add growth factors to them. You can add growth hormones. You can add antibiotics. Then you slaughter the animal. Now you don't add anything more. You can label that meat as all natural. How cheaty is that? That's super, super scammy, right? So stop eating everything that has growth factors, growth hormones, antibiotics, preservatives, pesticides, not pesticides necessarily, but yeah, if you can, all of those things. So that's on one side. That'll help avoid the damage that all those chemicals are doing to you. On the other side, start consuming whole foods that are plant-based, right? Whole foods that are plant-based. I'm not asking everyone to switch to whole foods, plant-based diet, right? That's hard. That's a hard switch. My family enjoys it. We love it, but it's not for everyone. But introduce as many whole foods that you can, not processed foods. Don't take a tapenade that has some moldy olives that have fallen to the ground and people pick them up and they're like, no one's going to eat this crap. Well, let's make a tapenade out of it. Just process it. It'll look good, right? Whole foods, go buy vegetables at the grocery store, a variety of vegetables, go chop them up and make some kind of a stir fry or grill them or something like that. If you can do those two things, I would say that you're going to help your gut microbiome a lot.
Absolutely. Dr. Momo Vuyisich, thank you so much for coming on to our show. Guys, if you haven't seen already, he is a wealth of knowledge and literally building the future in front of our eyes. So make sure to follow his work, friend him on LinkedIn, and until next time, thanks everyone.